of organized crime on the African continent. In a very short space of time, we've produced interesting research, and you'll hear about some of our flagship projects today. But a lot of it is available in hard copy, but especially on our website, and I encourage you to take a look at it. This seminar, though, is to launch 2 of our research papers. The first one is called The Heroin Coast, the Political Economy Along the East African Seaboard, and that's co-authored by Simone Haysom, Peter Gastro, and Mark Shaw, our colleagues from the Global Initiative, who will all be speaking to you about that today. These experts, whose work on organized crime in Africa spans decades, bring a wealth of knowledge and experience in research, but also analytical nous, and I'm sure you will be able to ask them some questions in a Q&A session afterwards, which you would find interesting. I think we're all aware of the flow of heroin down our African coast and into countries along the coast. But I think one of the key findings that this research points to is that apart from the social harm, which Dr. Ongolo will speak to, I think it's fair to speak also of a crisis of governance. The impact of these heroin flows, as the research indicates, impacts dramatically on governance, particularly on the East African seaboard, from Kenya, Mozambique, all the way down into South Africa. And Mark and his colleagues will speak to that in some detail. The second session of the seminar will be presented by Dr. Nelson Alusala, who works for the ENACT project at the ISS, and he will be looking at the illicit flow of arms, and particularly what the AU is doing to limit the flow of arms. That research paper is also being launched today, and its target audience is specifically the AU in support of its silencing the guns agenda. And I'm sure you will find some of those findings interesting too. So in launching these papers, our key objective really is to raise public awareness, put evidence-based findings in front of policy makers and stakeholders to inform a policy response, which could either be from the state themselves or from civil society organizations, and particularly journalists. Our intention is to provide these stakeholders evidence-based research analysis and data whose aim is to enhance a response to the key issues. And I'm hoping that in our discussions, while we interrogate the findings of the research, we can also think through what would be an appropriate response. So I welcome you all to our seminar, and I'm going to turn to my colleague here from the European Union, Raoul de Lusenberger, to make some opening remarks on behalf of the European. Thank you very much.
So there?
Wow.
I can be here.
Okay, good.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for being here, and thank you to ISS and ENACT for inviting me to address a few words. The European Union is not, in the way you normally see, or the way we evolved, a security actor. This traditionally was a competence of the member states, so you would have all the member states separately engaging in cooperation on security. This has changed in the last few years with a set of Council resolutions where the member states asked the EU to take an active role in security issues. And this has transformed the European Union in one of the main players in many respects on security. The way we approach the issue is through projects and cooperations of the type, like ENACT, where we try to support other countries so that they can avoid some of the problems that we have experienced inside the European Union. and where we try to transform in concrete terms our support for a multilateral governance on issues like fighting against organized crime. It is also our way to empower societies that very often face difficult situations into, become more resilient against phenomena like organized crime. But this is one of the aspects where we work on security issues. The EU is now one of the main players inside the GCTF, the Global Forum against Terrorism. It has developed a number of initiatives in this area and has appointed a special envoy on counter-terrorism. And you'll not be surprised, you've seen what has happened inside the EU in the last 3-4 years. Counter-terrorism is one of the key issues that we face. But we have also worked to increase the resilience of communities and societies inside the EU and outside the European Union in strengthening their internal response to phenomena like departure of their children towards Syria, or the effect of radicalism inside their society. Now, I come, let's put it, in the EU we would say the country I know best, meaning the country I come from, is a country that has been ravaged by organized crime. It's Italy. And by traditional organized crime organization that all of a sudden had developed into a more serious, and powerful structures, thanks largely to drug trafficking. In the Italians of my generation normally have friends who have died from heroin, members of family who have died or who have been hopefully, taken back into society and recovered. But especially in the south of Italy, where this phenomenon is eradicated, this is the major constraint to economic development for the entire that part of the country. And the constraints come from a combined set of corruption. It's very easy for the organized crime that can leverage the money that heroin gives them to corrupt officials, to corrupt entire municipalities or boards of municipalities. We have had a number of cases where, the boards of the municipality have been completely, removed, some of them to jail, and the state had to intervene, setting up a kind of structure to manage the country, the town without elections, because that would have been problematic. Elections have been tampered with. The effect on society and on social issues was dramatic. And overall, the economic development has been completely shattered by the idea, because nobody is going to invest in an area that is controlled by organized crime. So very often things start with a little bit of a traditional production or local production, hashish in Morocco, another in the Reef of Morocco. Okay, but then it's very easy for them to develop into something that is extremely dangerous and very difficult to control. Once it's set up, it will not be. It's really a challenge for a state, even a state like Italy, to deal with some of the issues that this can present. So this is why we are here. We're trying to assist African countries where the phenomenon is developing at a speed that is very often difficult to control. Sometimes the state does not necessarily pay directly attention to this, because it's a way to, like it was at the for the south of Italy, it's a way to have some jobs created or there is a feeling. I mean, it's the same in the north of Morocco. There is a feeling that an entire traditional economy is taking care of themselves, and it's and it's having their jobs and their traditional lifestyle assured by a light form of organized crime. But organized crime moves extremely fast and develops into things that completely transform a society and transform the way the society works in ways that makes it very difficult then to go back into a more normal, traditional way of production, working. I mean, you're not offering a job to someone who is used to get 500 euros per night by simply driving a boat in or out with some drug. You're not offering him a job at 100 euros per month. He will never take it. So this kind of incentive structures, effects, are much more pervasive than we normally consider, and this is why we think the work of this project is extremely important, and this is why we wanted to support you in doing this. Thank you very much for your attention. Sorry if I've said something that is obvious. Thank you very much.
Yes. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It is a great pleasure for me to welcome you all to this seminar, which looks at the heroin economy and arms control in Africa. I wish to thank first the two speakers who who set the scene actually for our discussion this morning. So thank you, Eric. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you very much. I just wish to remind the colleagues that this is really we also have an online crowd, those who are following this seminar. So please just note that we are operating under it's a non-Chatham House rule. Sorry. So what this means is that you can cite somebody without an explicit consent of that person. So you can request for that, but you cannot cite that person without explicit request. So, but for the first part of this seminar, we will really be operating under open rules, so which means that you can cite because we'll be having presentations which will be direct to you. So only when we move to the second part where we have questions and answers, then you won't be able to cite any person without explicit consent. So we call that the ISS rule, or some call it the Chatham House rules, but just note that, please. I will remind you as we go along. One thing, house rules or house matters to resolve. Please, on your seat, you saw this form, which is an evaluation form. Remember to complete that form at the end of the seminar. It's extremely important for us. We need this form in order to improve on future seminars, on future work of the Institute for Security Studies, and particularly INACT. So please remember that. And let me then, I think Eric said it up front, the purpose of this seminar. It is a two-part seminar which we present two recently published studies of produced by INACT. Actually, the first one, which Eric also mentioned, deals with the heroin economy. Let me show you so that we all know what I'm talking about. So this is the first paper that we'll be looking at, produced by the INACT study. So it's the heroin coast, the political economy along the Eastern African seaboard. You can find this paper on the shelf out there, so please, if you haven't gotten a copy, make sure that you just go out to the shelf and obtain a copy. So we have enough copies for everybody. To start with, so we'll have the first session on this paper. Then we have the authors who are here with us, Simone Heston, Peter Gastro, and Mark Shaw, who will say something about their findings of the paper. So we have here already at the podium, we have Mark Shaw, who is here, Peter Gastro also, Simone. Okay, can you just stand for them to see you? Okay, thank you very much. So what will happen will be, in terms of the rules of procedures of this seminar, we will have each speaker, especially presenting the paper, each speaker will present 15 to 20 minutes to give us an overview of the study and the key findings. Then we will also, this will be followed by a discussion, which will be for 40 minutes. But to precede that, we will want to have a continental perspective of what this issue of drugs is all about. Remember, if we are talking about fragility in Africa, I think drugs trafficking or drugs abuse, arms proliferation, illicit arms circulation in Africa constitute, in my view, what I see as the fundamental factors that cause fragility in Africa, and therefore this seminar is extremely important for that. So then, I just want to again remind you under these rules of procedures that please keep your telephones on silence so that there won't be any interruption, especially during the presentations. Without much ado, I would like to really go straight into the business of our course today, to invite, I think, Mark Shaw, who will organize the... no, please, sorry, I was looking at a different schedule. So we're going to start with that continental perspective, which is going to be provided by Dr. Jean-Marie Ongolo. She is head of the division in charge of social welfare and drug abuse within the AU Commission. So Jane is going to tell us how the AU see the issue of drugs, how they see the problem in Africa as a continental issue, and to situate that, or to set the scene for what we're going to see in the paper, so that we can better interrogate the paper on Heroin Coast to see whether the findings really reflect the continental perspective and the challenges that we have on the continent. Jen, I would like to call on you if you can give us this brief overview. Pardon? I think because you have a presentation, you can present from the podium. Okay. Are you ready? Okay, please. Is it fine? Okay. So Jen will take 15 to 20 minutes to give us this overview of the AU perspective. Thank you, Jane.
Thank you very much, Martin, and thank you for the organizers for inviting the African Union Commission to provide some thoughts on the situation of drug control or drug issues on the continent. So a bit of the issues that you already know, but nevertheless it's important to restate some of the challenges that we face with drug control on the continent. I work for the African Union Commission, mainly responsible for social welfare issues, vulnerable groups, and working on drug control as well. So over the last many years, we've been working on continental coordination mechanisms on the continent. So a lot of what I'll be presenting today relates to reports that we receive from member states on the situation on the ground, as well as UNODC reports. So, as we know, Africa is no longer transit country. It's destination country as well. And a major player, real major player in the global trade in narcotics. And part of the reason that Africa has become such an attractive destination has to do with global demand for drugs, the changing patterns of use, and intensified law enforcement in what is traditionally the destination region of Europe and America. So, all types of drugs. I'm not even mentioning cannabis because it's a given. All regions in Africa experience drug trafficking and consumption of cannabis. But recently, Africa and Asia have emerged as cocaine trafficking and consumption hubs. Just over the last 2 years, since 2016, there have been doubled quantities of cocaine seized in Africa. And out of this, a six-fold increase in the Northern African region. We'll be interrogating why some of those regions, all of a sudden, the trafficking has increased. There's also the expansion of the southern route of Afghan heroin trafficking, including through Africa to Europe. And Mark will be presenting about the heroin problem in the Eastern African region. We are also seeing rise in seizures of pharmaceutical opioids, mainly tramadol, which has caused a lot of havoc in the Western, Central, and the Sahel regions of Africa. So just a spot check of the regions. What drugs are we seeing in different regions of the continent? Eastern Africa remains significant entry point for heroin in Africa, both as destination and transit from South and West East Asia. And emergence of cocaine syndicates. This is very new. For a long time, Eastern African region was known for heroin trafficking. But the last 2 years or so, emergence of real cocaine syndicates in that region. Northern Africa emerging as a serious hub for cocaine, but we're also seeing amphetamine-type substances, mainly for the large market in the neighboring sub-region of the Near and Middle East. Bar, as well as tramadol, which I'll have a separate session looking at tramadol. Western African region continues to be an attractive route for drug trafficking. There's been significant transit. It is a significant transit route to Europe, North America, for the illicit drugs produced in South America and Asia. A few countries, Ghana, Nigeria, they're on the spotlight. Not that the rest of the countries are not affected, but significantly the last 2 years, these countries have really emerged as being important routes. The use and production of amphetamine-type stimulants, in particular methamphetamine, being destined to countries, Asian countries and South Africa, are being seen in those regions. There's also ephedrine destined for South Africa from Nigeria. So not only trafficking outwards, but also trafficking within African countries have been experienced. South Africa, mainly because of its good transport infrastructure, it continues to be a key node in the trafficking class of drug A category of narcotic or psychotropic drugs to the destination countries. Transshipment of cocaine and heroin have been witnessed. Trafficking of methamphetamine, mainly produced in this region. Reports that we receive at the African Union Commission, South Africa has very, very sophisticated methods of dismantling clandestine laboratories that produce these substances. Mozambique as well is becoming an important route for heroin to Europe, as tighter enforcement has closed some of the well-known more direct paths to Europe. As I said, there's this synthetic opioid called tramadol that's emerging as a very, very serious threat in the Sahel region, in West Africa and Central Africa. It is smuggled to various markets in West and Central and Northern Africa, though some of it is trafficked onwards to the Near and Middle Eastern countries. The source of the tramadol mainly diverted from illicit channels, but most of it originates in clandestine laboratories in Asia. But this has been fueled by a growing regional market. As many people also use it for recreation, it is perceived to improve mood and enhance energy. But the resultant consequence is that a majority of people get addicted to this substance. To illustrate how serious the problem of tramadol is, the seizures from Africa accounted for 87% of the total global seizures in 2019. And the yearly seizures have risen from 300 kilograms to slightly over 3 tons since 2013. Just wanted to bring this to your attention. I'll not go into it. Our technology has been facilitating drug trafficking, or has the potential to do so. There's this newspaper article, you have it, you can look at the link, that indicates that WhatsApp communication is being used to make communications very easy for small quantities of heroin to be carried and to be transported, mainly using airlines. So this is worrying. I came across this article when I was doing this presentation. And for sure, if mobile phones can be used for this without any tracking, something serious is happening. Having presented the status of trafficking, what are the challenges that we are facing? I think we must start by the fact that we must state at the onset that drug trafficking is a lucrative business. Traffickers seek for markets and will always look for the weakest link in the chain as they constantly change their methods and routes. As I said from the beginning, most of the trafficking has been displaced to Africa as enforcement intensified in Europe, in America, and the Asia. So for as long as we remain the weak link, business, this lucrative business, will use the region to prosper. We are facing porous borders and coastlines, political stability in a number of countries, and that probably can explain why all of a sudden there's an increase of cocaine trafficking in the Northern African region that has experienced obviously some turbulence over the last few years. We experience weak criminal justice systems and what we may not be so willing to talk about, relentless attempts of criminal groups to intimidate and corrupt officials. At the social level, we are looking at poverty, high youth population, unemployment, that all serve as potential breeding grounds for criminality. Having said that, we don't know the extent of the situation we are dealing with. A lot of the reports are generated by the World Drug Report. Most of the information is from the World Drug Report. But how many countries from Africa do really report? The last World Drug Report, less than 14 countries reported. So how much extrapolation can we have? So until we begin to invest in reliable and gathering reliable and comprehensive information, we cannot meaningfully address the problem. This lack of coordinated efforts nationally, regionally, and internationally to counter drug trafficking and abuse. International cooperation initiatives are often piecemeal and take time to become effective. We face, of course, the constant new threats. We have tramadol, the new psychoactive substances, the use of technology, etc., etc. Continental response. The African Union Commission, as a majority of you are aware, has developed the Continental Developmental Framework, Agenda 2063, which has two aspirations, talking about good governance and peaceful and secure Africa. And the understanding that as long as we don't have stable countries, as long as the guns are firing, many criminal organizations will use the void to carry out this activity. But significantly, at the operational level, we have the AU Plan of Action on Drug Control and Crime Prevention for the period 2013 to 2019. And one of the priority areas that the Plan of Action looks into is countering drug trafficking and related challenges to human security, with a view to reduce trends of illicit trafficking and supply. At the moment, successor plan is being drafted. During the processes that led to the UNGAS discussion, the UN General Assembly Special Session on Drugs that took place 2016, Africa brought its voice to the table by developing a common African position, which, amongst other issues, stressed the urgent need to respond to the serious challenges posed by the increasing links between drug trafficking, corruption, and other forms of organized crime. So this is something that collectively member states came up with, and it's our hope and understanding that member states are taking action to make these goals a reality. In terms of the Plan of Action on Drug Control and Crime Prevention, 4 critical areas that the AU has been collecting data on: establishment of legal and policy frameworks and strategic information. We note that over 75% of the countries have legal frameworks, and about 56% have been conducting assessments. However, many of these legal frameworks are outdated and are not able to deal with emerging transnational organized perspective that drug control has taken. In terms of capacity building in research and data collection, in 2017, the African Union Commission is working with member states to establish national epidemiological surveillance networks and observatories. At the moment, 15 are operational. Several studies being conducted. We have the comprehensive assessment, the threat assessment on drugs that took place, covered West and Central Africa in 2014. This just to name a few. It may be that others have been conducted that I'm not aware of, but the point in illustrating this, just the few of these, is that most studies are being generated out of the continent. So we need to put our house in order and begin to conduct our own studies regionally. Looking at improved capacities for criminal justice system, the African Union is setting up AfriPol, which amongst other activities it will be conducting is to look at trans-border crimes such as drug trafficking, human trafficking, with a view to conduct mixed joint unit operations with 4 or more countries at any particular time. Wish to note that UNODC really has also supported the continent in conducting several broad-ranging criminal justice activities. Mechanisms to combat corruption, money laundering, and for witness protection. About 38% of the countries have mechanisms for witness protection, 69 mechanisms for money laundering, and 66 mechanisms to combat corruption. So in terms of frameworks, we're not doing well, but what's lacking is the implementation. How we carry forward some of these mechanisms to ensure that we can follow through with tracking criminals. Recommended practical measures from where we sit. We need to have improved capacities of law enforcement and criminal justice entities to be able to keep up with sophisticated and agile modus operandi of criminal syndicates. And seriously, for these institutions to begin to move from lower levels of interdiction to also target specialized, to have specialized investigation skills, looking at financial intelligence, anti-money laundering efforts, asset recovery, use of modern technology and tools. For whereas many of the prisons are full with small fish, but the people managing the big syndicates are not touched. We need to look again also at improved access to strategic information, including intelligence sharing. At the advocacy level, and considering the dependence of many people on illicit economy, to begin to advocate continentally that we address the causes for dependency on illicit drug economy, that is poverty, social exclusion, discrimination, thereby providing enabling conditions for gaining licit and sustainable livelihoods. And we also need to understand efforts, we need to put in place efforts to understand emerging threats, the use of technology. We may not be so much into the darknet already, but the signs are there. Better understanding to stop flow of synthetic opioids packaged and destined for non-medical use. So I restricted recommendations to a few practical measures that we can begin to think about immediately. There are many other things that we can talk about. In conclusion, to sustainably consolidate our credibility and build the Africa we want, we must move beyond catalog of good intentions. As I've said, the frameworks are there. We need to take the next step. And in this regard, all of us, we need to collectively step up responses to cope with these challenges. And one of those areas, as we advocate in our various spheres, to advocate for practical measures to allocate appropriate funding for the implementation of the AU Plan of Action on Drug Control and other continental mechanisms. Otherwise, the African Union Commission's fundamental role remains to coordinate, monitor, and evaluate implementation. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for that, Jean-Marie. Really, I truly enjoyed the presentation because you have clearly mapped out the situation in Africa, giving us a continental perspective where the problems are really concentrated and where they are not the kind of drugs that are being trafficked in different parts of the continent. I mean, I see the problem to be really vast, from tramadol to methamphetamine to cocaine, heroin, and then you've clearly stated, the role that the continent is playing globally, and the fact that we are suffering from this problem because of really lack of enforcement and because of the stricter enforcement in other regions like Europe. So they are pushing the problem to Africa, which means that if we can step up we can step up our enforcement mechanisms, really we can be able to address the problem. I'm not going to summarize what you said because I think it was really clear. It was a presentation that was straight to the point. And because we need to catch up with time, I would like to call on Mark to present the Heroin paper. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for attending. In fact, I have the easy job this morning. I'm going to make some very brief introductory comments and then hand on to Simon, who's going to do the bulk of the presentation, also drawing on inputs from Peter. First to say, it's really a privilege to share the platform with you, Denmarie, and continue to work with the AU as the ENACT program continues to unfold. This is the first time that the three of us have actually been in a room together to present this particular paper. So I'm not sure that's good or bad for you in that we all want to have our little say. And we are have been very eager to try and make sure that the paper reflects as best we can the consensus of the people we spoke to, including in both illicit and illicit economy, people in law enforcement, government, policymakers, and others. And Peter and Simon have continued, in fact, to travel up and down the coast since the publication of the paper. We have presented it in a number of places and have got, I think, very interesting engagement and interaction with African audiences along the East African coast. And indeed, this meeting is a continuation of that process. I want to make just 3 points which I think are really important as a foundation to the paper, and it reflects some of the points that the EU Deputy Ambassador made already. The first point is the paper demonstrates once again how integrated Africa is into the global criminal economy. And what we are seeing here is effectively part of the impact of increased production in Afghanistan. And so the degree to which Africa is not isolated in any way. You often, in discussion with Africans around issues of organized crime, the argument is often made that Africa is separate or slightly different or doesn't have an organized crime problem. In fact, that's not the case at all. So the high level of integration of Africa in the global criminal economy. The point to make on that too is that while volumes of drugs transiting or being of use on the continent might be comparatively smaller than elsewhere, given weak institutions, given conflict areas, etc., the impact is often much greater. Because the resilience of communities is lower, and so the impact of both drug use and drug trafficking for a variety of issues, I think, can be greater in the context of Africa. The second point Jane Marie has already made very articulately, and that this is not just a transit economy. And that's very, very clear from the East Africa Heroin report, if you have the opportunity to read it. The idea that this is just heroin transiting down, going around the Cape and onto Europe is simply not the case. There are higher and growing levels of use in all of the countries, which began in the coastal towns, but moved and have moved into the interior. And that includes the case in South Africa. So the spread from the major Zanzibar, Mombasa, etc., to well into the interior, the degree to which trafficking networks and use have moved into the interior of the continent. And that this is cheap heroin, which is poor quality, mixed with all sorts of other things, and it really affects the poor. And many people in the room would know heroin is terribly addictive, and the cycle of use means that people become isolated from their families and communities. They are often the target of a harsh police action, and they become really isolated and in a sense, live lives that become very, very, very difficult. And we have, in the context of this report, been speaking to communities, people who are using drugs along the coast, and you can see the great suffering that is brought along the coastline. But it does two other things which we want to illustrate. The first is that the cash economy, which is what the local drug economy is, drives low-level police corruption. And that's true in South Africa, but it's true all along the coast. Because this is a cash exchange at low levels, it breeds a form of low-level police corruption as well as higher-level corruption given the volume of resources that are involved. And it, in particular places, and Simon will say more about that, bolsters protection economies. And I think that's particularly true in the context of South Africa, but not only. Protection economies which are more mafia-like, to protect the geographic zones where drugs are sold. So to emphasize the second point that I want to make, it's not just a transit economy. The problems are not just use, no matter how bad they are. There are several important knock-on effects. And then the third point that I want to emphasize, and the last point, but I think it's the most important and the unique contribution that we hope that the paper makes. And that's to say this is a regional economy, and it requires a regional response. And that regional response fundamentally, of course, has to be in law enforcement. I know there are members of the Hawks in the audience, but it has to be political. That there needs to be a regional political response to a regional criminal economy. And if you take away any conclusion from this paper, then that's, I think, one of the key conclusions. And having worked, as I think people know, a long time in Cape Town and working in areas where levels of drug use are high, often the debate about gangsterism and drugs very seldom talks about the source of drugs. It's about policing and how we can end people being drawn into gangs, etc. It very seldom, it's like almost drugs just pop up in those communities. But drugs don't pop up in those communities. They come down through a particular complex political economy which is changing and evolving all the time. And part of our policy response can't just be policing Mitchell's Plain. It needs to be reaching up to the coastline, both from a political and a law enforcement perspective, to be able to respond to the problem. So those three themes seem to me to be, in our discussions, some of the key conclusions. So with that, I will hand over to Simon, who has led the work along with Peter along the East African coast. We really hope, and the paper has been widely distributed, as I have said, we really hope that it continues to have an impact, continues to drive a discussion about the complexity of responding to the issue of the heroin economy. So over to you, sir.
Thank you, Mark. Just to remind the other two colleagues who are going to present to really summarize their presentation so that we can catch up with time and have sufficient time for discussion. Thank you very much, Simon and Peter.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be presenting these findings in South Africa, where this coastal economy is having such a large impact. And I hope it's just the starting point for thinking through some effective responses. This report really came about, was sparked by a mystery, which was from about 2010, the Counter-Maritime Force, which is an international maritime force that was initially set up to combat piracy in the Indian Ocean, began boarding dhows that had come from Pakistan and Iran under the pretext of a flag of convenience search, and finding large amounts of heroin, hundreds of kilograms, even a ton at times. Yet in countries along the coast where these dhows were headed, there were negligible or no seizures on land. So the question was, what was this magical commodity that was visible at sea but seemingly invisible on land? At the same time, the exception to this was South Africa, where without any concerted strategy, there were sporadic seizures of vehicles coming from Mozambique, which were carrying heroin. And right before we began the report, an accidental find of 1 ton of heroin about to be shipped to Europe, disguised amongst wine cases. We set out along the countries along the coast, Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, and South Africa, conducting over 200 interviews. And we came up with findings that are summarized in this map. It's quite hard to see on the screen. It's inside the reports. If you pick up a copy, I believe it's on page 9. Now, what that map shows you is a route which both relies on ancient trading routes, dhow-based trading routes that make use of unmonitored coastlines and small beaches, and trade routes that make use of major ports and the infrastructure for global trade. It also shows you a map of political protection of a trade, because you can see arrows moving across the territories where there was seemingly no visible heroin. I won't go into this in much detail. We used a methodology for the report that relies, as Mark said, on talking to people as close as possible to the illicit economy, in building up a mosaic picture in order to see something that people want to keep hidden, or which is normally covert. Both Mark and Peter have extensive experience in this methodology, and if there are any questions, we can deal with them after the presentation. Needless to say, it was conducted with a large research team, which also included local researchers who were really able to get very close to the ground and to visit a large range of locations, from capitals to very out-of-the-way towns and border posts. I also won't go into periodization too much, but I will say that while the report provides a picture of the southern route as we could understand it in 2017 when the research was being conducted, a picture which continues to evolve. It's one that has been building for decades. And that relates both to internal dynamics in Africa and external dynamics. As Mark mentioned, in this case in particular, the dramatic rise in the production of poppy in Afghanistan, which is processed into opium and then heroin. The core analysis of the report provides a characterization of criminal governance systems along the coast. We use north, center, south, east, south in part to demonstrate the regional integration to get out of the thinking of borders. Needless to say, though, the north refers to Kenya, the center to Tanzania, southeast to Mozambique, and south to South Africa. We characterized Kenya as being a criminal governance system of multipolar competition, Tanzania as a disrupted market, and so on, as you see on the slide. We'll go into more detail about what that means. To come to these characterizations, to assess criminal markets, we look at a number of criteria. This includes levels of violence, levels of competition between criminal actors, the number of criminal actors, and then we also look at their relationship to corruption. Are they getting by on petty corruption? Have they moved to grand corruption? These criteria are sometimes counterintuitive. A criminal system which has very low levels of violence is not necessarily one in which there's low levels of criminality. In fact, it may suggest a criminal market in which there's a high degree of consolidation by a few very powerful actors. Peter is going to explain what this means in Kenya and Tanzania. Peter, over to you.
Thank you. Let me go back to a very important comment that Mark and Simon have made, namely that we need to really adjust our thinking about the occurrence of drug smuggling in countries to one of a regional phenomenon. I stress that because the eastern coast, the region, as you will have seen from the map, is porous and it flows from every country into another country, and the law enforcement and other development responses have not yet caught up with that. But I want to also stress that the regional criminal economy does not mean that the nature in which the criminal networks operate in the different countries is more or less the same. There are distinct differences. It still requires a detailed study in all the parts of the region to be able to understand how they work. For example, we have labeled the North, Kenya, as a country in which there's multipolar competition. And the interesting thing is that we found that the political economies along the coast tend to, in many respects, reflect the political system in government. For example, in Kenya, it's not like in Mozambique, where the party is in charge and has been in charge for many years. there is intense competition between powerful politicians who change parties, who rename parties. And if you are a drug kingpin, who would you invest in? Not the party, because you don't know what's going to happen to the party. You look for the individual leaders who are likely to be able to provide patronage and protection. And therefore, multipolar. There are a number of powerful individuals in the criminal sector, in the criminal market, and the same applies to a number of political parties who compete for power. If you move down to Tanzania, it's very different. In Tanzania, the new president has significantly disrupted the both political and criminal markets there with a very powerful, strong anti-corruption message, but also with a very powerful intervention style, which has really also caused severe problems in communities and in other areas. I think the jury is still out as to what the overall impact will be, but there, who would you invest in if you're a drug kingpin? No longer as in the past, where there was a settled leadership elite that you could approach. Now it's disrupted, and you really are not sure whether or not you're going to get protection from individual X or Y. Are they going to be in power? Is Magufuli going to lock them up or not? So the fragmentation that is reflected in the formal politics of the country is also reflected in the criminal market. Lastly, just a comment on Mozambique. Won't deal with South Africa. Mozambique, again, is very different. Mozambique has had decades of a political cohesion by the dominant party. So if you are a drug kingpin and you want to transport your heroin from Nacala to Maputo, the obvious door to knock on is the party leadership. Because the party leadership can provide you protection and can ensure that the patronage is available. Very different from Kenya and Tanzania. So the market we describe in Mozambique as a consolidated market. It has been consolidated for decades because the party has been playing such an important role. In South Africa, I think Simon will probably deal with that. Again, a slightly different situation because politics is in transition in this country, and the crime kingpins are also a bit nervous. There are new ones in power who want to clean up corruption and crime, but there are old ones, still powerful, who want to maintain it and keep it going. So all I'm saying is, whilst we're dealing with one regional criminal market along the East African coast, we deal with different aspects and different emphases as far as the way in which they operate. And anyone who wants to get involved in trying to counter this will really have to ensure that they keep their nose and eyes and brains close to the ground to understand the differences in the different countries. That will be effective rather than one size fits all. It's not correct along the coast. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. I will just draw attention to one additional feature of the Mozambique example before moving on to South Africa. One of the strong findings around how the heroin route moved through Mozambique was that the port of Nacala was incredibly important, and that this was a substantially criminalized port where a small number of families who were said to be the ones who controlled the heroin trade had become the most prominent businessmen and in a very tangible way owned the port, owned infrastructure, owned the transport companies that provided services within the port, and then also had this relationship with the political elite that meant that their containers were basically just not scanned by very sophisticated high-tech scanners, which Mozambique had procured, I think, with donor funding. There's a quote up on the screen to that effect. And this was very illustrative of something that was found along the coast, which was this intertwining between business, politics, and crime. Several heroin traffickers have businesses within the illicit economy too. this provides both complexities in identifying their role and in disentangling them from the political economy. We were told that in amongst the Mozambican political elite who sanctioned a heroin movement through the country, that it was considered a victimless crime. Mozambique is a transit country. It has a very low level of heroin consumption, we believe, though it's hard to tell because there haven't been recent drug surveys. And the heroin, in their view, was going to Europe, and in the past, Europe had sent guns to Mozambique, and this wasn't seen to be such a huge problem. However, we argue that there are, in fact, victims within the region, and there are victims just to the south of Mozambique in our own country, where a large-scale heroin crisis has been obscured to an extent by the multiplicity of terms that are used to describe different, what are thought to be different drugs, unga, wunga, naope, sugars, but which, while they might have different additives, all have at their base heroin. Mixed with a very harsh and not evidence-based public health response on the part of the South African state, which is compounding quite severe public health problems. You'll find in the report a table comparing HIV and Hep C prevalence rates amongst injecting drug users, numbers of drug users. It's illustrative. It's drawing on a number of different surveys. We don't actually have comprehensive figures for the scale of this crisis in the region, but we still thought it was important to illustrate it to some extent. There's another local impact that's incredibly important in South Africa, and that relates to violence. Cape Town, where there is the most competition over control of drug markets, leads the country's national murder rate. The increase over the last few years as competition over those markets has increased has led to such a substantial rise in Cape Town that it's actually driving up a national rate. Not that there aren't also rises in other parts of the country. We also monitor criminal assassinations, which have been on a steady increase over the last few years, which we believe are an indication of turmoil and competition and destabilization within criminal underworlds. This isn't solely about heroin, but heroin is one input into this mix, and one that has grown substantially in the last few years. I won't go into our policy responses, except to say that I would say that you could say that they fall in two broad camps. One being around strategically, how do you understand the issue and address it? My colleagues have made comments already about a regional perspective. I've also addressed this relationship between politics, business, and crime, which is incredibly important to address, as well as the cost of doing politics and how that drives political figures into the arms of people in the illicit economy. Another set of them relates to what Mark mentioned in the beginning about broadening out our understanding of who should address the crisis. While efficient and effective law enforcement is crucial, the response needs to be broader, needs to be political, and we also need to think creatively about other people that can be brought in at a community level to increase resilience, to combat violence, to about supporting better public health responses and the adoption of harm reduction, not just within public health departments, but also having law enforcement on board in that, as well as supporting civil society to document and create a narrative around organized crime and corruption and how we combat it. And I will end on that point, say thank you for listening, and we look forward to your questions.
Indeed, I feel guilty that we have not been able to really do justice to such an important topic, to such a very rich paper. But I believe that we'll have other opportunities where we can look at this. But to tell you, the paper is available on the INACT website. It's for free, so you can download it from the website wherever you are. And you can also pick up copies outside. It's a very, very rich report. You can hear from the presentation. These are just synopses of what the report presents. So you have a lot of details which, will really thrill you. So I'm particularly encouraging you to visit the INACT website to download the reports and other reports that are available on the site. I think the three presenters have given us really a very sharp summary of the key findings that they looked at. I was particularly thrilled by the characterization of the market, which indeed I never really looked at it from that perspective. And I was really grateful that somebody could put it in such clear terms, because it is not just the characterization. You characterize something in order to also solicit the responses, because responses have to take into account the type of market that you are dealing with. So thank you very much, Mark. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Peter, for the excellent presentation. We're going to go into the discussion, but before I open the floor, I just want to inform and really thank also our online audience that we have come to the end of the open session. They won't be able to follow this session, and this means also that we now kicked into the closed session where the Chatham House rules take effect, and this means that you cannot cite any intervention or any person without a very explicit consent from that person. This is particularly, it goes to the media, it goes to anyone who will be quoting any aspect of this meeting. So once again, thank you very much, our online audience, and I want to open the floor now for